Back to Senate. Welcome back to Senate Education. Our final piece of business today is looking at S203, an act relating to the appointment of the State Board of Education members. We've had a walkthrough, and I want to welcome Ms. Johnson and Ms. Smith. Thank you both for coming into Senate Education. We've had a walkthrough of the bill. We've done a little bit of work on it. We know that the House is sending us a miscellaneous education bill. I would think that that's probably the likely spot that something like this would go, because we are going to need some testimony if the committee decides to move in this direction. We're watching a process. Our friends in natural resource and energy, as you may have followed, are changing some things around fish and wildlife, which, I mean, these are big decisions and complicated decisions. We just want to do our due diligence. But we thought we might start with the two of you, since it does alter the role of the governor. And Senator Gulick, you're the lead sponsor on this. Do you want to say anything else? We've had a walkthrough.
No, just that, I mean, I think it's pretty, clear and basic that in my mind, it seems like, the ed fund is now about $2 billion. Education is obviously at a sort of like a tipping point right now, or at least the funding of education is at a tipping point in our state. It's all over the news. Everyone's talking about it. Education is a huge part of Vermont culture, the way of life here. And it seems as though the appointment of the State Board of Education should be a shared responsibility between the governor and the House of Representatives and the Senate. So the legislature writ large should have a hand in this, what seems to be a very, very important body. Thanks.
And then I would also just add, and I appreciate Senator Gulick's comments, there are also some of us out there that really would like to even rethink a lot of different things. And I've been public, for example, I would love to see the State Board not involved in the appointment. I would love to see, different things happen. So we'll see where we get, but this is certainly a good spot to start. So with that, thank you both for coming in, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having us. I'm, for the record, Jay Pershing Johnson, the governor's legal counsel. And thank you for that explanation. I think that's helpful. I think that my first question really, which I don't usually start with a question, but is what is the problem we're trying to fix? From our perspective, the board is active and engaged and acting in accordance with their statutory mandates. So it's doing what it's supposed to do. And I think that the legislature always has legislative remedies to direct policy. But the way that you're going about that is not through that, but actually through changing the composition of the board without changing any of the board's duties and responsibilities. So on its face, my concern is that this bill violates the principle of separation of powers. The bill takes a board with clearly executive functions, and it packs it with a supermajority of agents of the legislature. And I think this unconstitutionally encroaches on and usurps the governor's duty to faithfully execute the law and enter into agreements with officers of government, which is part of the role of the board. So because nothing in this bill addresses anything else in Title 16, and as you say, and I really appreciate, Mr. Chair, that there may be lots of moving parts under consideration. I think that's important to note. But nothing in this bill changes the board's executive powers or duties under Title 16. So under 160, at the very least, and I'm not an expert in the education law, and I have not looked at all of the instances where the board may interface with the agency. But under 16 VSA 164, which relates to the board's general powers and duties, the board is responsible for rulemaking, which is an executive branch function, regulatory standards, which is an executive branch function, programmatic and implementation functions, which is executive branch function, as well as the governor's constitutional authority to enter into agreements with other states and the United States. So when you take a look through the list of the numerous responsibilities of the board, you can note from it a number of areas where the board is actually performing as an executive branch entity. To simply hand that over to agents of the legislature, again, I think is a violation of the principle of separation of powers. The way that this would work is the change to the board would give the legislative branch 6 voting members and the governor 3 voting members on the 10-member board. The board has no statutory quorum requirements, so they rely on Robert's rules per board rule. And according to Robert's rules, a quorum is the minimum number of voting members who must be present at a properly convened meeting in order to conduct business. So it's not members appointed, it's members present. So for this board with 9 voting members, that would be 5 for a quorum, and a majority vote could be as low as 3. So the legislature would control 6, thus taking the role of the board out of the hands of the executive branch. Again, this is the separation of powers issue right there in a nutshell. The legislature does not perform executive functions. That's just unconstitutional. So a supermajority of the council is composed of legislative agents, subject to the appointment and reappointment of the legislature, not accountable to the governor. The board is effectively only accountable to the legislature and, of course, to the special interests that they represent. So you're making up the board of a number of special interests, except for maybe, I think, 1 parent and 1 at-large member. And the students presumably are, interested in the interests of the students generally, and that's, been the policy for a long time. But otherwise, you are handing over policymaking to a number of special interest groups. The legislative agents can effectively act without the executive branch members to call a meeting, elect officers, and adopt procedures and rules it deems necessary for the performance of their work. Again, this is not a legislative function. And as much as the legislature may not like the structure, it is actually the 3-branch structure is inherent and important to the functioning of our democracy. I think to disregard that is well, unconstitutional. And the fact is, the governor isn't a town manager, right? He's not somebody that the legislature hires and fires. I mean, the governor is accountable to the voters. And the executive branch is accountable to the governor. And executive branch function is all and should be accountable to the governor. This structure clearly encroaches on and usurps the governor's constitutional duties key duty is to faithfully execute the laws. So he's unable to do that with a board that is not accountable to him. That's the key concern.
I'm going to interpret something that is just.
Yeah.
Thanks. So the board, so just trying to get a sense of the accountability piece.
Yeah.
So right now, you have a Secretary of Education, who of course we know reports to the governor solely.
Like every other secretary.
Like every other secretary, which we changed many years ago.
Yes.
And so that board, there is a line there. So then the agency, so the state board reports to the secretary reports to the governor. That's the sort of in terms of the executive branch.
Right, and the governor
guess
makes the appointments as well.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of, is there another agency in state government that you can think of that works like this, where there's this kind of board out there that has these kinds of powers?
This is unusual. It's
Yeah.
definitely unusual, and I was trying to think about that. We have, every other agency and department has
Yeah.
rulemaking authority. There's no intervening body that makes policy. It kind of, and I think Secretary French may have made this point in the past, kind of hamstrings the agency, actually. They are working sort of under the constraints of whatever this body, as the policy-making body, decides to do. And they, by statute, work together and in collaboration and working with the governor's office and all
Yeah.
of that, but it is an awkward, and different kind of structure.
Yeah, if I may, I think everyone here will be familiar, this is kind of a vestige of when we had the Department of Education
Yeah.
with this more empowered board structure, so to say. And when, oh gosh, over 10 years ago, thereabouts, when we changed over to an agency of education model, the way the board functions wasn't necessarily cleaned up at the same time. So we were left with this kind of hybrid approach
Right.
that is unusual.
Yeah.
In terms of how the executive branch is structured elsewhere. I would just add on, or before we back up another level, is that I think what you led off too with, we're on the precipice of a large conversation around public education, and how we are able to transform it, how we're gonna finance it, right? We're waiting on results of many town meeting day votes and digesting those and trying to figure out how to make sure that our public education system is stable, and sustainable and best serving students. I think there is, in that broader conversation, space to think about what is the appropriate role for the state board and who's on it, and that division of duties between the agency versus a board, and rolling, if we're gonna make changes to the State Board of Education into that much larger vision of where we're trying to go with public education in Vermont, again, to make sure that it's best serving our communities and our students. And so that would be my, again, Jay's gonna maybe continue to go through some of the legalese pieces as well, but would be our preferred approach, I guess, as we're looking at any changes to the board.
And I see Senator Gillick, I see your hands up. I just want to say, and I do hope when we have this conversation, I mean this in no disrespect to the state board or its members. I just think like anything, it should be on the table as to whether or not we need a state board. Or if we restructure it at some point, even when I think about myself in this chair. Sometimes, again, with great admiration for the state board and their work, it streamlining, if we're talking with one person, the secretary always, it might make more sense. I don't know. Senator Gula, please. You have a question?
Thank you, Chair Campion. Yeah, I guess a couple comments and maybe some questions as well, but I'm a little taken aback and shocked at the some of the claims that have been made in the last few minutes. The insinuation that the legislature would be usurping power from the governor is, I find that shocking for one thing. This is not a usurping of power. This is literally about appointing some people to a board. So that's number one. Number two, there's no question of changing the statutory role of the board. Again, I don't understand what that claim means and where that's coming from. And I would like to know exactly who is being referred to as private interest. If that could please be fleshed out a little bit. I don't understand that claim either.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I guess I can't clarify for you the simply appointment of people to a board question that you seem to have. The issue is the appointment by the legislature to the board. It's as if the legislature were saying, and you do, actually, I mean, you have reserved powers of appointment. There's no doubt about that, but you can't use those powers in a way that interferes with the governor's duty to faithfully execute the laws. So if say the legislature were to say, we can not only appoint the Board of Education, we can appoint every secretary on the governor's cabinet. I think that there would be concern that this would be a usurpation of the governor's executive function.
But that's not what we're saying.
Okay, all right, then to address your question of
And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, so if somebody were appointed, we still have the power to reject the appointment, I believe.
Correct.
Yes,
These
so
folks are subject to Senate confirmation.
do Senate confirmation.
Right, so the legislature would be appointing and confirming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please continue.
The special interests would be principals, superintendents, all with associations, teachers, school board members. These other providers, I think, would fall in the teacher category. And again, then parents. And I think that that leaves one at-large member. All of these people have associations. And I believe that they probably, it's not clear, and I mean, while I think there is a much larger constitutional issue with the bill, there is also a structural issue in that you have created all of these categories of specialty. And then it's not clear from the bill itself who appoints which specialty member. So I think that's typically spelled out when the legislature takes this kind of approach, say for an advisory body. That just is another sort of structural issue there. The point that I guess I would make in terms of like the Constitution would be, and again, maybe it's a difficult concept to understand, but under the Constitution, legislative power formulates and enacts laws. Executive power enforces laws, and judicial power interprets and applies laws. That's a quote from the Vermont Supreme Court. So the legislature's role ends at the point that a law is passed, enacted, signed into law. The executive branch takes over from there, faithfully executes the laws. In Title 16 itself, with respect to the functions of the board, there are provisions that specifically refer to, say, number 7, adopt rules pursuant to 3 VSA Chapter 25, which is administrative rulemaking, which is an executive function. And 2, carry out the powers and duties of the board as directed by the General Assembly within the limitations of legislative intent. So here you have a body appointed by the legislature, subject to Senate advice and consent, carrying out the duties of the board as directed by the General Assembly. I mean, I don't know how we could be any more clear than that with respect to what the problem is with respect to separation of powers. At that point, you have jumped over into the executive branch fold. You know what I'm saying?
This is helpful. Senator Gulick, please.
Thank you for questioning my understanding of constitutional law. I appreciate that. I would just again say that we're not I'm trying to take notes as you're speaking. I'm not seeing that we're changing the charge of the board. This is strictly defining, giving some guardrails to the makeup of the board. You call it special interest. I call it people who live in the world of education, which seems like a good idea on a state board of education. And again, yeah. I will leave it at that. I'm not going to argue this point, but since I have the floor, I will ask, what characteristics does the governor look for when he appoints people to the board? Can you shed some light on that?
I believe that's in Title 16, but I could be wrong. Didn't we give the governor direction at one point?
There is, hold on. Let me pull it up here.
Kendall's pulling it up.
There is, so while I am hopefully, and of course, it's like when you have to operate electronics quickly, that always backfires. I'm pulling it up. I believe there are some statutory requirements around what the membership guardrails are for members. But typically when we have an opening, most of the time those openings are advertised and we collect a number of applications that come in of various folks, showing their interest and talking about why they would be good fits. We consider the types of qualities that already are represented on the board, and try to look for geographic, gender, racial diversity to make sure we have a good cross section of folks represented. And I do think just to agree with you though for a second, Senator, yes, I think having people that have education experience, special education experience, CTE experience, showing different facets of our education system is something we do already strive to have in the board membership, especially when I think of some of the current board members and their experiences, either as academic researchers or in the CTE system or as former educators, is definitely a helpful perspective to have. So I would not argue that point at all. And sorry, now not on the internet. So I don't know if I'm gonna be able, I apologize, getting my little exclamation point here to pull up the statute. I don't know if anyone else, again, is able to quickly, but there is some level of guidance in there around membership requirements.
Right, and I certainly do not intend any disrespect to any of these group represented. The point that I'm saying is that they, under the current structure, with the governor appointing the members, those members, regardless of their affiliation, or their qualifications, are accountable to the governor. And that's the separation of powers issue. Our system is set up for accountability to the chief executive of the state. This dilutes that by essentially making that board accountable to the legislature, the members who appoint them. This is the issue. While I see what you're saying, and again, I think that it can be cured structurally, as Kendall suggested, as the chair suggested, if you're looking at alternatives, the legislature can still, there are numerous options here, right? I mean, the legislature can still act in accordance with its own constitutional powers to pass laws and conduct oversight and investigations, right? With respect to greater instruction, perhaps to the board regarding policymaking, or greater instruction to the governor about who should be appointed. It could do what it often does and appoint a nominal number of legislators or legislative representatives who do not control the quorum of the board. So say two, and that's often done. There are now legislators on almost every board and commission, with a special provision that the legislators receive the legislative per diem, right? That is often done, and it's a nominal number, and it provides representation.
And just to be clear, I believe, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Senator Gulick, you're not proposing legislators that are on there, just that the legislature would appoint. Just for my own clarification, I don't have it right in front of me.
That's correct. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
So they're agents of the legislature,
Yeah.
they're appointed by and
Okay,
can be, well, it's funny that I have another structural issue with respect to removal. There is another provision in Title 16 that provides the governor with the authority to remove the members. That's still untouched in this bill. But they're accountable to, they can be appointed and reappointed by the legislature. That right there is the accountability issue. Accountability for an executive branch entity would essentially be removed from the hands of the governor. So the legislature, again, could do what it often does, appoint legislative members, appoint legislative agents, but a nominal number, not a quorum of the board. It can certainly create, as Kendall suggested, an entity tasked with long-term strategic vision. There's a lot of that kind of language in the board now, right? If what you want is a visioning body that's made up of, making policy recommendations to the legislature and to the governor's office, you can appoint an advisory body. I mean, you can cure this by making the board more of a visioning and advisory body for purposes of policy making for education. You can certainly do that. The board already has the authority to establish advisory committees. That's the kind of authority that a visioning body with policy making recommendations can do. I mean, so there are a number of things in the board roles and responsibilities now that could be adopted by this body that you're trying to create. And at the same time, you take those executive functions, rulemaking, standards, regulations, agreements with other states and the United States government, you give that to the agency, right? Those functions that they need to be able to function optimally as an agency. So I think that there is a way that you could structure this so that it is shared decision-making regarding policy, but there are recommendations made to the legislature and to the governor's office.
I see Senator Gulick's hands up.
As I always say, this will be my last question and comment. But I do think it'll be important for us to hear from a constitutional lawyer for sure. I feel like I have a lot to learn if these claims that we're hearing today are all true. I also just want it for clarity's sake, for my own personal edification, is it true that when someone is appointed that they ipso facto become an agent of that body? I do not believe that to be true, but I would like to hear from a lawyer if that is the case. Because when we're thinking about appointing folks to this board, I don't necessarily see them as becoming suddenly agents of the House of Representatives or the Senate. But we can maybe learn more about that at a later date. Thank you.
It's an interesting question, and I don't, I'm not an attorney, but I'm glad you're here. Maybe you could say something about that?
Yes, I am an attorney, but so I appreciate that. In my view, I would say that the way that appointment and reappointment and removal would work as a constitutional concept is that you're accountable to the entity that appoints you, right? I mean, we have argued in the past that while the legislature may give the governor the power of appointment, but then remove the power of removal, that's unconstitutional. Because again, that person, that officer needs to be held accountable to the governor. And what the legislature has done is then create standards, right? You can only remove for cause. I mean, it depends how you structure that, but those are things that we've lived with, forever. So I feel like there are ways to do these things. So my thought from a constitutional perspective is that an entity or a person that's appointed by the legislature, that can be removed by the legislature, that can be reappointed by the legislature, is only accountable to the legislature. If not the legislature, who are they accountable to? Clearly not the governor. So, and at that point,
How is that clear? How is that clear?
not elected,
Just one second, Senator Gill, please.
so not elected, so not accountable to the voters. I don't see how they are accountable to anyone.
I mean, maybe, and then I'll turn over to Senator Gill, maybe the concern is that somebody might lobby the legislature to be involved, to be put on this board. Lobby the Speaker of the House, and I'm not saying it's a problem, I'm just saying maybe one of the things that's being articulated is there's concern that somebody might lobby the Speaker of the House or the President pro tem to be on a board that has executive function. Maybe that's part of what.
It's not the lobbying per
Okay.
se, it's really just the appointment power. Who is the person you've decided to appoint going to be responsible to, right? If that board is performing an executive function and the governor is the chief executive officer of the state, I mean, like it or not, that entity needs to be held accountable to the governor.
Right, Senator Gulick, please go ahead.
I just want to say I agree with that. It's not in the bill to change that. So I'll just leave it at that.
So if the governor maintains removal power, that's something that you're contemplating?
Is that something?
We didn't put that, that's not in the bill, but certainly something we could contemplate.
Well, it already is in Title 16 now, that the governor can remove the members of the board.
So it sounds like that would stay.
So that would stay if it's not outlined in the bill, then that would stay.
If that's your intent, that's an interesting structure. Something we have to talk about, but it certainly is an accountability mechanism. The problem would be meaning the General Assembly appoints 6 members. The governor removes the member. The General Assembly then reappoints the member or a member. I mean, this seems like a system's designed for failure.
Senator Weeks or Senator Williams, any questions or comments at this point?
Tracking.
Yeah.
The other thing I would point you to is just a little bit of case law, in addition to what I cited, which is a case called In Re DL from 1995 at 164 Vermont 223. I would point you to the constitutional provision in chapter 2, section 5, that says the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments shall be separate and distinct so that neither exercise the powers properly belonging to the others. And in Vermont, this is fairly, I mean, this actually in the case law is very loosely interpreted because the court recognizes that there are lots of gray areas where the legislature and the executive need to work together in order to efficiently function as a government. So the court also says, although the separation of powers doctrine does not contemplate an absolute division of authority among the three branches, it does ensure at a minimum that no branch will usurp the core functions or impair the independent institutional integrity of another. And that's in Brady v. Dean from 2001 at 790 A second 428. So, I mean, this is the idea of sharing power is and decision making is certainly appropriate in certain circumstances, such as I mean, we need to work together all the time on things like budget decisions, or I mean, there are certain kinds of things where the legislature, the joint fiscal office working with the governor's office to approve grants in the interim, say. I mean, that is sort of a process that you need to actually, because the legislature has the appropriation power, the governor faithfully executes the laws, that's an area where we can work together to sort of share that decision-making and policy-making authority. So with respect to the appointment of limited service positions or accepting grants, things like that. That's where, something like that has been tested and found to be constitutional. So the last point that I would make is the court, when it says the focus of a separation of powers inquiry is not whether one branch is exercising certain powers that may in some way pertain to another branch, but whether the power exercised so encroaches upon another branch's power as to usurp from that branch's constitutionally defined function. That's where the quorum issue is relevant. If the members, the agents of the legislature, essentially can function as a quorum and make decisions without any input from the three executive branch members, that's when the legislature has effectively moved over into the area of exercising executive branch powers. And that case is Hunter v. State, 2004 at 177 VT 339.
Would you mind, I don't think you've submitted any testimony
I haven't.
yet. If you don't mind, if you wouldn't mind, just summarizing, listing those
Mhm.
as well as, just an overall summary of the administration's position, that would be great.
I can do that. Yeah. So, I mean, that's where I think that, it's this sharing yet division
Mhm.
of powers. And I think really the crux of what's happening here is the entire takeover of the board by agents of the legislature. The fact that there's a quorum, the fact that Title 16 PSA 164 is not changing at all with respect to powers and duties. So effectively, you have agents of the legislature doing executive branch rulemaking, again, in accordance with the policy of the General Assembly. Legislature gives us the direction, and the executive branch is responsible for carrying that out.
We will summarize all of this like you asked in a memo, because I'm sure that everyone was able to write down all the pieces.
Yeah, I have a bunch of,
The
With
body
the
block,
links,
yeah.
the body of block
Yeah.
pieces, but we really appreciate your time and the invitation to testify and share feedback on it. I just would reiterate again too, as we're looking at, the much larger question around public education and sustainability and what we might need to do to support that system over the coming, honestly, like right now in this inflection point in the coming years, how does this fit in like a much larger context?
Right, and again, it creates great opportunities for, participating together on something like a visioning body. That's making recommendations regarding policy.
final questions, looking up on the screen. And Senator Gulick, she's ill today, so, yeah, so, but. Anything else?
No, I'm still processing the testimony, and still a
It'll
little
probably
bit,
be,
a little bit
help
shocked, frankly.
writing and just those two court references, which are, yeah. With this is, things. Ms. Smith, thank you for joining
Thank you.
us. Ms. Johnson, thank you. You're always welcome to come back to
Thank you so
Senate. We
much.
may indeed have you back as we continue to work on this.
Yeah.
So, great, okay,
We appreciate the information.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, committee, any other business of the day? We have 2 final votes tomorrow. And hopefully Senator Gulick, if you're up to it, if you're feeling better, we'll see you tomorrow, but glad you're taking, glad you're resting and, or at least at home, it doesn't seem like you're resting. Great. And Senator Gulick, we will follow up, we'll have, so of course, that's the administration's position. We also have Ledge Counsel. We'll hear from the St. James. We'll hear from Peter Teachout, who's a constitutional lawyer that the legislature calls on a lot of these kinds of things. So I'm sure this will be a robust conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate
welcome.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay,